welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on economic sociology, we are going to understand today what we understand by the so-termed affluent society. Now, before we go to understand affluent society, we see that in anthropology and in most of sociology, the understanding of the coming of market society, capitalist society was done on a comparative and evolutionary paradigm. In that sense, the market based industrial and the capital society was considered as a stage of development of the primitive economy. And in that comparison between the primitive or the hunting gathering society or the Paleolithic society, the understanding was that the former is more kind of a society with lot of underdevelopment, scarcity, and therefore the term affluent was more useful to understand the capitalist society. In today's lecture, referring to the work of Stone Economy by Marshall Chalin, will try to understand how he negates the assumptions of understanding pre-market society and kind of trying to understand that these society were the original affluent society. So, an affluent society can be defined as a society which is characterized by the availability of the benefits of material prosperity. So, this whole idea that the primitive society or say the pre-capitalist society did not have material prosperity and therefore the outcome was that they are not affluent society. Now, in the year 1966, in a symposium held in Chicago, the theory of the original affluent society was put forward by Marshall Chalin, an American cultural anthropologist. During this time, new research by many anthropologists posited challenges to the conventional idea that societies of hunting and gatherers were always at the brink of starvation and burdened with the struggle for survival. So, the entire way in which the anthropologists say located in an industrialized advanced society were looking back, and they were of the opinion that the primitive society or what has been termed as hunting and gathering society did not have material prosperity, and they did not have material prosperity in the sense that they were almost in a situation of scarcity or they were always less of resources and therefore in conditions of starvation. Now, when we look into this work of Stone Age economics by Marshall Chalin, he kind of turns the entire understanding upside down and he says that we need to kind of re-examine. So, he turned the conventional wisdom on its head, offering a bold re-evaluation of the prehistoric economics. Anthropologists often described their life was hard, facing starvation, technical incompetencies led not only doing as much needed for survival and therefore the concept of subsistence economy. No surplus, no leisure, inability to build culture, staying close to nature, lowest in stages of development, less energy, less capital per year than other modes of production, and therefore it was kind of consisted as an illustration of a subsistence economy. Now, the subsistence economy is one of the earliest stages of economy, where the term itself says that you survive by as much as you need to kind of require. You do not go outside the necessity, you are only kind of involved in producing as much as you need it, and beyond that you kind of neither do extra production nor do you kind of ensure leisure, and therefore they kind of were considered to be one of the initial stages of economic modes of production. Chalin rejects this assumption of hunting and gathering society by using the concept of original affluent society. Far from the primitive struggle for survival depicted by modern industrial societies, Sahalin unveils the profound sophistication and efficiency of hunter-gatherers community. So, basically he is trying to do away with this bias with which anthropologists were looking at the primitive society as an earlier stage of development, and the idea was, why were they kind of arriving at such an understanding, is that they were looking at that society from their own lens, and to them they kind of appeared to be say uninterested in materialistic life, or kind of content with as much as they have. And in his argument he will kind of reject all this and say that they were kind of equally engaged in this material production, and the satisfaction was there because of their desire not to have extra consumption, not to go beyond the requirement, which is again has its own problem. So, by examining the concept of original affluent society, he argues that these societies were characterized by abundance, leisure, and a deep sense of community, challenging the capitalist notion that wealth and satisfaction stems from endless accumulation. So, when we compare the primitive society with the capitalist society from the argument that Marshall Shalin has given us, then there are different ways of acquiring satisfaction. Satisfaction is not necessarily attained through materialistic accumulation, which is characteristic of a capitalist society. Now, why do we need to kind of rethink about the endless accumulation is also the outcome of too much of capitalism, where the conspicuous consumptions and too much of production has created its own set of problem, and therefore the requirement to go back and look into the pre-capitalist society where there was no such sense of materialistic accumulation, and yet the society was kind of affluent, or they had leisure, they were enjoying the sense of community. Now, before we actually understand the original affluent society and compare, they say, the hunting gathering society with the capitalist society, let us understand what Marshall Shalin meant with the concept of an affluent society. So, according to Shalin, by the common understanding, an affluent society is one in which all the people's material wants are easily satisfied. Now, when we kind of say that the society has certain needs, they have certain wants, and if that want is satisfied, then you are an affluent society. So, if we go to this understanding of affluent society, Shalin gives us two possible cores to affluence. First is the Galbraithean way, and this Galbraithean way kind of is a theory about human wants and the structure of society as described by John Kenneth Galbraith and Marshall Shalin. The theory suggests that human wants are large, but people can satisfy them by producing more or desiring less. So, the entire problem of going on too much of accumulation is that people's wants have increased and the desires have increased. So, one way to control is to produce less or to desire less. So, in that sense, if production is less or the desire is less, then obviously there will be no question of conspicuous consumption. The second way of creating an affluent society is desiring little and meeting wants with what is available to them. This is often the case in hunter-gatherer society, and Shalin calls this the Zen road to affluence, which states that human material wants are finite and few and technical means unchanging, but on the whole adequate. So, the idea is that you do not have unrestricted wants, or you do not have unrestricted resource. You have a restricted kind of a resource, and therefore, you have to satisfy it with whatever resource is available to you. And this is what Shalin says was the case in the primitive or the society. So, the comparison is between Galbraithian way and the Zen ways towards affluent society. Unlike the Galbraithian way, where man wants are infinite. In the Zen way, the means are limited. Both type of society, and obviously here the Galbraithean society way would be followed in a capitalist society. The Zen way is obvious in the hunters-gatherers society. However, in both type of society, they take different roads to affluence. The hunter-gatherer by desiring little, the Westerner by producing and consuming a lot. So, here is Salin's major argument that affluence is there in both primitive and primitive hunting gathering society and in the capitalist society. What is the difference? The difference is that in a hunting gathering society, people's desires were less. They did not desire more than the resources that was there. However, due to technology, due to better modes of communication, in a capitalist society, our wants are increasing. More and more every day we have new wants, new desires. Now, to meet these desires, which is beyond the available resources, the only way out is to produce a lot. And when production is over and above the resources, the consumption will automatically increase. So, basically the problem in a capitalist society is where human being gets captured in this process of producing more and then consuming more. Adopting the Zen strategy, a people can enjoy an unparalleled material plenty with low standard of living. Since there exists a culture of limited wants amongst the hunter-gatherer community, according to Salin, they were able to live their lives affluently by means of a quick satisfaction of their simple material needs. So, the basic very simple understanding is that in the primitive society, the means were kind of limited. However, they were not creating a problem. Why? Because the wants were less, the desire were less, and therefore the consumption was less. So, people were satisfied with whatever was available, and they were not kind of going beyond the available resources and material to accumulate more and more. So, in traditional society are affluent according to Salin, and he argues that since the hunter-gatherer societies can satisfy or meet the limited desires that they have with whatever is available to them, they can be labeled to be affluent. Now, we have in the beginning said that the anthropological literature is kind of full of certain kind of phrases to describe the primitive society as subsistence, as underdeveloped, lacking interest, lack of material desire to accumulate. Now, we need to kind of trace the source from where these misconceptions are coming. An anthropological opinion of hunting and gathering is that it is a subsistence economy with limited leisure, an incessant quest for food, meager and unreliable natural resources, lack of an economic surplus, and maximum energy from a maximum number of people. Now, where are these misconceptions coming about from? And in his work, in the chapter on the original affluent society, Marshall Salin gives us two major examples, the empirical examples. One is the Aboriginal group from Australian Arnhem Land, and the second is the Bushman from Africa, particularly the Doe section of Kung Bushmen. Now, referring to these anthropological case study, Marshall Salin will argue that both these societies are giving us instances of affluence. They are kind of completely an affluent society despite the absence of certain characteristics which are to be found in the so-called affluent capitalist society. So, the hunting gathering economy has also been debated since the time of Adam Smith. Now, a lot of the misconception or the sources are coming from pre-existing literature. Much of these literatures are coming from economists, from anthropologists, and these literature, the way they have described the primitive society, have led to the construction of a misconceptions of the society. So, in the market industrial society, production through the behavior of price and distributions are all arranged through the behavior of prices, and there is a sense, always sense deprivation and scarcity in the market industrial society. So, the whole argument that the primitive hunting gathering society is a scarce society is in itself stands questionable. Why? Because in a market industrial society, everything is measured through prices and everything has to go through the market demand and supply, and therefore there is a sense of scarcity because there is always deprivation and your wants are never met. There is always a certain section of your desire which goes kind of unfulfilled. Therefore, the sense of scarcity is completely high in the society. Marshall Salin states that scarcity is the judgment decreed by our economy, where the application of scarce means to the alternative ends to acquire satisfaction. Salin further comments that this scarcity, still not seen intrinsic to the property of technical terms, rather it is still perceived as means to an end. The hunter's economy was downgraded because of the existing bias in anthropology and ethnology, where they positioned themselves in a neolithic revolutionary and compared the hunter's economy with that to the neolithic economy. As Leslie White explains, while the neolithic advancement was in direct relation with cultural development because of the per capita per year of agricultural and pastoral output, anthropological discontent could also be traced in the field where the ethnocentric vantage degraded the hunting gathering society. So, there is a certain level of bias, the ethnocentric bias, where the anthropologist belonging to the Western advanced society, in an attempt to show their superiority, in an attempt to show that they are more advanced, they are more cultured, kind of described the primitive society as kind of lacking the material need, having scarcity. So, that comparison between the simple society and the advanced society kind of is based on certain kind of ethnocentric bias. Now, the Neolithic culture was based on domesticated plant and animal resources as opposed to effort as the principal energy source. The Neolithic Great Leap was a major technological advance that brought about a general downgrade in anthropology. Ethnologists and archaeologists had become Neolithic, revo-congenial, even necessarily theoretically to adopt the usual tone of the Neolithical economy. Now, we have traced the source of misconceptions. Now, when Salin argues that the hunter-gatherer society are affluent society, he gives us certain evidence which to kind of prove his statement. The first evidence is that he used an observation made by Karl Marx that in poor nations the people are comfortable, whereas in rich nations they are generally poor. To reinforce his theory that Paleolithic societies followed a Zen road to affluence, people enjoying material plenty with a low standard of living. Now, here is the subjective way in which we even explain poverty or we explain what implies by being poor. So, there could be a sense of poorness in terms of not being able to accumulate, but the sense can also be there where there is a high level of accumulation, but yet there is scarcity. So, this idea is that we cannot understand the economy by comparing, but we need to understand each of it in its own culture, in its own context. The second evidence used by Marshall Salin is he undermines the opinion of Huskowitz, who infers that Aboriginal only barely survived in the tough and remote environment by highlighting how little untutored European observers know about where, what to extract from local flora and fauna. So, the entire way in which you look towards nature, whether you can be able to extract as much as is required for your subsistence or you are going to kind of exploit, is how will help us to understand the two types of economy. The third evidence used by Charlene is that the technology available to them, the bow and arrow, provided a sufficient means to obtain their simple objective of health. Now, the idea was also in terms of advancement. So, the Western anthropologist would kind of label bow and arrow not as a kind of a technology, but an underdeveloped, and they're unable to extract the maximum from the nature. And that led to the growth of technology, where you had more sophisticated machines, where you had more sophisticated ways to extract the maximum from the nature, from the fauna and flora. Why? Because the wants had increased, the desire to fulfill more and more increased, to increase production. And how do you increase production? You will increase production by applying machine, by applying technology. And therefore, the kind of the evidence is that as much you need not necessarily go beyond and exploit the nature to fulfill your wants. Additionally, Charlene refers to recent archaeological evidence to question whether Neolithical people who followed were liberated by labor saving devices, example domestication of animal, introduction of simple agricultural regime, and thus able to experience cultural advances, or if in fact it was due to the population having the privilege of settlement. So, another point of comparison is that the earlier primitive society, or when we use the term hunters and gathering society, they were on the move, they were kind of, they did not have a fixed settlement, and therefore they did not have the scope to kind of accumulate. Where would they kind of store this accumulated wealth or property? Even technology could not be too sophisticated, because it would have been difficult for them to move from one space to other. Now, as society kind of progresses and this kind of starts having a settlement, the shift will take place, and there is where the want to accumulate will start. People start domesticating animals, they start kind of using a better agricultural means, because with the settlement you need to kind of have multiple else thing. When you are on the move, and especially the primitive society, only the want was to have enough to eat and sleep. But now when you start having a settlement and you need to domesticate animals, there will be several other wants that will emerge from that, and you need production and you will require more and more consumption. So, this is how the economy would progress. The author gave an empiric example from Richard Lee's study of the Dobe Bushman in 1969. This study details the activities of the Dobe Bushman people as related to the economic activities and leisure time. As compared to the common assumption of these society, the study of Richard Lee is to the contrary. The study provides us with the quantitative data that quantifies the amount of time the Dobe Bushman people spent on subsistence activities. From his data, Richard Lee shows their time for substitute activities were a mere fraction of their free time for leisure and other pursuit. In Richard Lee's work, empirical evidence is provided that the contradicts the misconception of hunter-gatherers society. Unlike the long held assumption with no empirical or historical trend or backing the work, thus laid the foundation for many studies of these society and shed new lights on studying the transition of human society not through the lens of starvation, but rather as a means of adaptations to one's surrounding. So, it is not that the primitive society were facing starvation, they were content with whatever product they were able to produce, and it is not that they were spending all their time in terms of collecting and gathering food. They had equal kind of a division of time for leisure and other activity. However, the context of their livelihood was different. As the livelihood changes from say a nomad to a settled agriculture, their economy will accordingly change. So, that therefore, what we need to understand is the adaptation of new surroundings. Now, Marshall Salin uses a phrase of plenty in order to understand the affluent society, and it is kind of how much is considered as plenty. The idea is that were the primitive society on starvation, where they had scarce or there was plenty, but the meaning of plenty was different. So, considering the poverty in which hunters and gatherers live in theory, it comes as a surprise that bushmen who live in the Kalahari enjoy a kind of material plenty, as they adopted to the tools of their living to materials which is present in abundance for their use. Now, what is plenty? Is it a material goods which is in plenty, or it is the non-material good which is in plenty? So, for the Europeans, the state is one of deprivation, because they were constantly comparing the Kung with their European way of lifestyle. So, we understand that even the bushman and the primitive society, they had a material of plenty, where the kind of understanding is different. So, when we look into the non-subsistence sector, it can be divided into two parts. First belongs to the collection of food and water, and the other is non-subsistence. In this sphere, the needs are usually satisfied. So, when we look into Marshall Salin's understanding, he is saying that the primitive hunting gathering society, the non-subsistence sector was dominant, and they had a material plenty which is not necessarily the say market and materialistic good, but they had a lot of sense of culture, the community life, and lot of sharing. And therefore, what is that they had not institutionalized material good. So, in the sense that they were also kind of understanding that this material of plenty, or material which is kind of considered as plenty, is a bourgeois construct, and it is kind of limited, and we need to kind of have a more broader understanding that savages were happy as they were apart, and they were away from two tyrannies which we find in capitalist society, and that is ambition and avarice. So, the desires is less, the want is desire, you are self satisfied and you have plenty and you are an affluent society. This is the argument that Marshall Salin makes in his work Stone Age Economy. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.